This speech comes from Pathways Level 1 Dynamic Leadership and is the evaluation and feedback speech. The purpose is to present a speech on any topic, receive feedback, and apply that feedback on a follow-up speech, either repeating or doing it again. Beth is going to stick with the Remembering History theme. So the title is 1891, My Family's Immigration, and the length is 5 to 7 minutes.
Let me just read Beth's favorite historical moment. The Statue of Liberty, sculpted by Auguste Bartholdi, was presented to U.S. Minister Levi Parsons Morton in Paris on July 4th, 1881, to commemorate the perseverance of freedom and democracy in the U.S. and to honor the work of the late President Abraham Lincoln. The Statue of Liberty Enlightening the World was to be an international symbol of liberty, justice, and democracy. Beth.
Thank you. There was a time in this country where immigration was welcome, wasn't such a big deal, and because we're talking about history today, I decided to tell you about the story that I know about my family's immigration. So the story begins in 1872, 76 to 78, actually 1877 to 78, when the Turkish-Russian War broke out in Russia. At that time, there was a family living in Russia, Herman Leander and his wife Elaine, and they had 6 children. The youngest was a boy and there was 1 girl. My great-great-grandfather Herman was a Turk, but his wife, my great-great-grandmother Elaine, was a Russian. He had to leave Russia because he was a Turk and therefore in danger. So he said to my great-great-grandmother, "Come on, pack the kids up, we're going to Egypt." Because at that time, Egypt was hospitable to Jews. And there wasn't a lot of anti-Semitism back then, but it was beginning, and ultimately, you can find the roots of the Holocaust in anti-Semitism all over the world throughout history. So she refused. Apparently, she came from a very wealthy family. They were comfortable. My great-great-grandfather was an attorney, so they were very comfortable, and she did not want to uproot the family and go to Egypt. So she said, "You go, I'll stay here, set up a home, and we'll follow." Great-great-grandfather would not take no for an answer, and so out of vengeance and spite, he took the youngest boy, Joseph. Joseph was only about 6 years old, and he took him, and off they went to Egypt. Well, this was not a great idea because the little boy held my great-great-grandfather back quite a bit. He couldn't work. He always had to worry about the child. And there was so much stress that he ended up having a heart attack in a hotel that they were staying in, or an inn. Joseph didn't really know how to get home, didn't really know much about himself. And so he thought his father was sleeping, and he left the door open and did what 6-year-olds do until the innkeeper found my great-great-grandfather dead. And they knew that Joseph had to be Jewish because they had artifacts of some sort, whatever they were carrying, Testament. And so they took Joseph, brought him to the Jewish services, and they put an advertisement out. A family from Odessa that didn't have any children adopted him. And for 4 years, he lived with the family until the mother died, and then the father died, and so once again, he was an orphan. They put out another ad in the paper, and this time, the story becomes interesting because there's a sordid story, and then there's a more acceptable story. Apparently, it's the sordid story that's true, but we'll never really know. An Arab adopted my great-grandfather, and he was a wealthy Arab, a sultan, the story goes. And he had many wives and many children, and they all lived in a tent. Among the children were also helpers, people that weren't relatives. They were probably slave children, and they took care of all the needs of the family. And one of them was a stable boy, who my great-grandfather befriended. One night, the boy disappeared. And my grandfather, who had an ear for languages, the story goes, was able to learn Arabic at the time while the children were being educated. And he listened to what was happening, what happened to that boy. It turns out he was sexually molested, and he died in the process. My great-grandfather was frightened, and he escaped. They caught him, they brought him back, and who knows what happened. And that's where the story gets a little dark. But he then, another time, went to the stable, stole a horse, and rode away. So by this time, he's in his early teens and a survivor, and survived for many years, traveling around, making ends meet, because he only had himself, and becoming quite a man of the world, and learning many languages. He was tired of that bachelor's life and made his way back again to the Jewish services, and they put out another ad in the paper. In the meantime, the family had moved to America, except for one brother, Asher, who stayed in Russia. He saw the ad, and he wrote to his family in America and said, "I think we found the lost boy." They paid for him to come to the United States with an address in his pocket. He was about 20 now. Address in his pocket that he had to find in Boston. He landed in Castle Island in New York, which was the precursor of Ellis Island, and found his way to the shop. He didn't speak English or Yiddish, and he showed up with a fez, a Turkish fez, and a mustache, and told the barber who he was looking for. Word went out in the neighborhood, and down the hill came running the family. And they all embraced him, and he was, taken aback, but he was home. But he was sort of uncivilized. He wasn't domesticated, and it was hard for him. But apparently he was very handsome and had a wonderful personality, and ended up enrolling in Boston University Medical School at night until my grandmother, a dressmaker, met him and was completely smitten. My great-grandmother wasn't well educated, so she was afraid that she would lose him if he went to medical school, so she convinced him to drop out. They got married, and her marriage was not a good one. He drank a lot, he womanized a lot, he hung out with the guys, he smoked a lot. She took care of everything. She's still crazy about him, but it was not an easy marriage, and he died at 68 of bleeding ulcers. In the meantime, one of the children was my grandmother. My grandmother had my mother, and my mother and father are still alive, and here we are. And that's the story of my immigration. Now, how do I know this? Because I am the keeper of the family record, as it turns out. This is the diary. You can look at it if you want after, but this is the diary that my great-grandmother, dictated to my aunt, telling the story of the family. See, it's all right here. And this is Joseph, with the mustache. And that's the story. So thank you.